of familiar faces in here. So, welcome back to the first, post-apocalyptic. So yeah, this is the very first of our lectures since everything shut down 18 months ago. Thank you all for coming. Good to see there's a lot of people I recognize out here. So just a quick rundown. Upcoming lectures. So the next lecture will be, or actually the next event that we will be having will be on October 16th. We started doing some events on the front lawn during COVID, and they went over quite well. So we're doing another one of those. It's called the Walk Through History. We have basically a reenactor timeline. We've had everything from French and Indian all the way up to Global War on Terror represented. So I'm not entirely sure who's coming. It's always kind of a crapshoot as to what reenactors are coming and what they show up wearing. So come on, check it out. It'll be on the 16th out on the front lawn, weather permitting, and if the weather's bad, we will move them inside and we scatter them around inside the museum. So feel free to check that out. October 24th will be our next lecture event, and that'll be Barry Levine wrote a book on Michigan aviation, people, places that changed history. He's another return lecturer. He did a book on Little Run and I think Yankee Air Museum. So he's coming back. And then November 11th of this year, Veterans Day, which falls on a Thursday, that will be this museum's 10th anniversary. So we've survived 10 years here as a brick and mortar. I'm not entirely sure how we did it, but we did it. So we're going to have a little event here in the evening since it's a Thursday. So feel free, come by the museum around 6 o'clock on the 11th and join us in celebrating 10 years. That will lead into that Sunday. We're going to have another lecture that Sunday. That will be the Under the Radar Michigan folks are coming out. So thanks to our sponsors. A couple of them are here. But thanks to the sponsors that we've had for the lecture series have stepped up. We've actually converted that to the full lecture. So Tom Dalton and Jim Edelman will actually be giving the full presentation of the video series. And we're hoping that they actually like what they see in the museum when they come back and maybe actually do one of the TV shows from here. And then our final scheduled event for this year will be on December 5th. It's Robert Krepke who's coming in to talk about Ford and the Arsenal of Democracy. So we do have some stuff on deck for 2022. The only thing that is actually solidly locked in right now is for February 13th, and that is Wyandotte at War. We have that book available if anybody wants to buy it in advance. So thank you all for coming. I hope you all enjoy. Without any further delay, I will turn it over here to Dan Mason, who's going to talk about Michigan and World War II.
Thank you, Chris. I appreciate you coming here. Thank you. So, anyways, I was asked about giving a little bit of brief history of myself. I work full-time for Federal Express as a tractor trailer driver, but actually graduated from Lake Superior State College, with a degree in history, which I never utilized. A buddy of mine said, "Hey Dan, come on out to Roseville, a certain weekend it was. The Yankee Air Museum was bringing their planes out for winter storage since they had just lost their hangar." Well, when I went out there was a young lady, I shouldn't say young, but anyways, she was telling me, and actually several of us, when she was a little girl, when the Roseville Naval Base was operating, planes used to crash by her house near the airport, and they were biplanes, of course, back then. And she said, whenever the Navy brought back to the airport, they'd always have a few parts left behind. So her and her brothers would pick up the pieces that they left behind and bring them back to the naval base. I come to find out she liked to exaggerate some of these stories, so I'm not really sure if they were actually true or not. But I told my buddy about this, and he says, and I said, something needs to be written about just these, the people from World War II, what they've done. You know, whether they were kids, adults, or whoever. And every book I've read sort of mentions about the people, but they never really talked about the people from Michigan during World War II. When everybody hears about Michigan, the arsenal of democracy, what do you hear about? You hear about the automotive industry and the bomber plant. So I said, yeah, why not? So I started working on that. And I've worked on this book for a little over 10 years. And one of the subjects in the book was about the women pilots. And I got in touch with a woman who's written extensively about the WASP, Women's Air Force Service Pilots. And I told her about the problem with the publisher, and she said, well, Dan, just pick out one of the subjects in your book and run with that, so at least you got your foot in the door as an author. I said, okay, it works for me. So my first book that I've written was Images in Aviation, Detroit Metro Airport. Now that worked out fine, but it was just sort of a stepping stone. But it made me the historian for Detroit Metro Airport on a volunteer basis. So if they had anybody that was asking for information about the airport's past, they would refer them to me. So they, for the past year and a half now, because of COVID, I have not been able to help them out with any of those type of questions, although I do get a phone call or two asking me about it. But I continued on with my history book throughout the past 10 years, collecting information from different small town museums and what was happening. And one of the things was too, I found out, and you'll see in one of my photos here, that I met a local celebrity. So I'll get into that. So originally, I had a title for Michigan's Greatest Generation. That was originally going to be my title. But the publisher sort of changed it on me and decided, why don't we just go with Michigan in World War II? And right here, the photo in front of you, that's a picture of up in Martin. Basically, it was right after the outbreak of World War II, where they were getting people to come out and enlist in the services. And you had the local band come and play, marching down there to gather people for enlistment. All right, does anyone recognize that skyline right there?
Detroit.
Yes, it is Detroit. Yeah. That's actually right there at the center of the Ambassador Bridge. I just sort of stumbled across this photo and thought it'd be kind of nice to put up. and you can see the gentleman to the right there, that's the Canadian, and then the gentleman to the left is the American. Weren't quite prepared at the time, but anyways, that comes to the fact that we had to protect our own borders. One of the things that we had to worry about during the war was Sault Ste. Marie was a potential target. With the Norway being occupied by the Germans, it was thought that if the Germans built a long-range bomber, they could fly up through the Arctic Circle, cross into Canada, and take out the locks in Sault Ste. Marie, which is a vital transportation area for all the resources for ore, iron ore, wood, food, anything coming through the lock. So they decided to make sure that that area was very well defended. So with barrage balloons, they used Fort Brady, which is now Lake Superior State University, as training grounds for winter training. You can see the locks right here, barely see it, but there's torpedo netting right there in front of the locks itself. So a lot of people weren't even aware of that. Sault Ste. Marie was a potential target. And if England had fallen to Germany, that would make Canada also occupied territory also, so they could probably take out the locks too that way. But we were not fortunate enough. British did survive the battle. The England survived the Battle of Britain. All right, again, our borders, we're susceptible for certain things. Have everyone ever heard of the Fugos? The Fugos were the balloons that the Japanese had released into the jet streams. These would make their way across the Pacific Ocean through jet streams. Eventually they would come down after the helium would drop out, and they were set up with an arsenal device right here. So anything that it would hit would ignite the bomb inside it and catch anything on fire. There's actually only one set of fatality of a family of this pastor, I can't remember this date, but I believe it was Washington, where it had landed in a forest area. The family discovered it, tampered with it, not knowing what it was, and it killed most of the family. That was the only fatality from these, but 3 of them made it to Michigan. Yes?
One made it to South Dakota. It's in the South Dakota Museum.
Very good. Well, I'll tell you about this. I'm not done yet. But this is as far east that the balloons actually made it, though. Michigan was the only known area. So we actually had one up here in Farmington Hills where it set a lot on fire. Later they found what remains of it. Not very much, but they discovered what it was because most of the balloon itself was set up to burn with the fire. But in North Dorn, Michigan, 3 boys just got out of school, seen this balloon and was wondering what the heck it was. So they started chasing it down and got so far where they had a family friend who had a pickup truck, followed the balloon to where it touched down in the field. It did not ignite. The balloon was still intact. So they were able to save the balloon, bring the balloon back to their house and notify the local sheriff. The sheriff didn't know what it was. So he contacted the FBI. When the FBI came, they basically told him, okay, we're going to take this, but you're not to tell anyone about it. Because a lot of people weren't even aware of these things. So they hung on to it until word got out in the newspapers about these balloons that they were able to talk more about the balloon itself. Now, over at, forgot the name of the city, but anyways, the city itself eventually got hold of the balloon later. It was a little small township. They found out the balloon from this one gentleman who was doing some research on these balloons, who was working for Channel 13 in Grand Rapids, and actually tracked down the actual balloon itself. There is a naval seaman out in New Jersey, the naval yard, and what he had discovered was, hey, I have to destroy these things. He asked the Navy if he can actually keep one for himself. So he brought it home. He brought it home to Minnesota. And while there, he actually flew the balloon downtown Minneapolis right after World War II had ended, and then folded it back up and put it in a container. And it sat in a container for years until he decided to get rid of it. It was on auction, and the town was able to scrape up the money, the museum, the Historical Society, and save the balloon. This balloon will be on display at the Kalamazoo Air Zoo eventually. They realized that they don't have enough room to actually have this balloon display at the museum, so then they worked it out with the Kalamazoo Air Zoo to display this balloon. There's another one on display at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton. How's that? Did that help you out there with the balloon? All right. Oh, you know what? I forgot to tell you the names of the boys. I'm going to tell you the names of the boys. 2 of them were brothers, Ben and Ken, and this is Larry. Ben and Ken Fine, and then this is Larry Bailey. Now, all right. So one of the things was, yeah, we had to raise money and save scraps of everything. So there was a lot of stuff going on, like saving the metal and donating it and getting it scrapping. So you can see right here, 2 high school kids, or high school in 2 high schools in Hamtramck decided to have a competition who could actually raise the most scrap metal. And amazingly enough, both schools were able to come up with cars for their scrap. And then one of the things was too, food. You had less farming going on because a lot of our men weren't working in the field, so local towns and groups, they would start having their own gardens, having their own fresh vegetables right there at home. So they would grow their own vegetables. And there was all kinds of literature and pamphlets put out how people could actually raise their own vegetables instead of growing flowers at their homes. And these ladies here with Quilting Society, what they did was they made this quilt and decided that with the money itself would buy war bonds with it. So they auctioned it, had an auction for it and raised over $200 for it. And one of the things I thought was interesting in my research is I came across this up in Marquette, this photo right here of this milk truck. And on the side of it, it says, turn in your scrap meats and your fats from your meats to your local butcher shop or milkman, and they would take these scrap meats and grease that they would save, they would actually use it for making gunpowder. And I found out later that Disney had produced a cartoon with Mickey and Goofy, I'm sorry, Pluto, about saving the fresh grease from frying, baking up, or any fresh meats. So at the end, if anyone wants to look at my computer, we tried showing it up on the screen earlier, but could not get the volume to work. But you can actually watch it on my computer afterwards. Oh, that's back around. All right, so again, the kids were very active in raising money, saving stuff, gathering up stuff. Right here we have milkweed pods that were saved for making light preservers. Scrap metals, drives. You had paper drives because they were using it, to get the paper. And then some of the stuff that they would do is right here with the glider, they would purchase equipment for the war effort. The schoolhouse in Greenville, Michigan, actually raised enough money to buy 4 troop gliders. Now, the first glider that was purchased was very interesting. General Hap Arnold came to them in the dedication ceremony of the glider being donated to the United States Army Air Forces, not Air Corps because we're now Air Forces. And he said he wanted to congratulate the kids, thank them very much, and he told them that this will be one of the first gliders in the invasion of Europe. Now, I'm finding out a few things about this. As in my research, I found out there's a few things in Michigan history that pertain to movies. This was one of them. All right. I got this in reverse, but let's go with this one here first. All right. So in the movie Saving Private Ryan, when they were going through and they had come across a crashed glider, the glider pilot was directing people around with his rifle over his shoulder. That was Hollywood, but it was a true incident. All right. So the general that wanted to be involved in this, or that was going to take charge in the invasion of Europe with the glider, actually had his Jeep in the glider. He had his steel helmet on. In the Jeep was the field radio, big size radio, and then he had 5 jerry cans of gasoline. He sat in the Jeep ready to roll as soon as the glider would hit the ground. Well, unfortunately, it was early morning, the grass was wet, it was a downhill slope, and the pilot himself could not control the glider. Now, the pilot, Colonel Murphy, I'll get the name straight here, Colonel Mike Murphy, was a good friend of General Arnold. He volunteered for the mission. He was a B-17 pilot, but did not have enough experience flying the gliders. He was a unique man because before the war, he was the first man to take a plane and had it modified so he could land it upside down. That was why the plane was like that. The guy took chances. But anyways, when he released from the tow plane, DC-3 or C-47, he was not aware of the situation on the ground. So when he hit the ground, he tried stopping because of the weight of the glider itself. could not stop, and he crashed into a hedgerow of trees. And he was flung out of the windshield, broke both his legs. In the movie, Saving Private Ryan, basically the pilot was walking around directing people. His co-pilot was killed. The general broke his neck because of the whole situation with the helmet on his head, jerking him around. And the general's aide made it without a scratch. This is the general's aide. This is General Pratt, Pilot Murphy, and here's the co-pilot, Lieutenant May. So these two, basically, they're gone. Murphy here had to wait until help would arrive to help him out. In the movie, they portrayed 22 infantrymen in the glider. There was nobody else in the glider when it actually happened. Just Hollywood adding to it to make it more interesting for the people that were watching it. And here's the glider itself with a GI, not local, but showing the sign of the glider. Greenville Public Schools, the Fighting Falcons. So I thought that was pretty interesting. Now I'm going to go back to this one here. This is Dr. Boris, Robert Boris, or I'm sorry, Boris, where are we at? Where'd you go, Boris? It's not, forgot his last name. Anyways, in his discovery here, he found that milkweed pods have the same characteristics as K-Pack that we were getting from Japan and Asia. He found that many of the things that milkweed pods characteristics, they could use this stuff to make filler for life preservers. And that was one of the things that we needed. So that was the reason why kids were always picking milkweed pods in northern Michigan area and Wisconsin. And you see, the wrong button, there you go. You see the kids out in the fields and picking, and you can see where the milkweed pods, the stuff inside was basically drying in these buildings. And Michigan was the only place to have a factory for the processing of the milkweed pods to make the life preservers. So we'll move on here. Now, remember Hollywood? This is from a movie, Victory. Does anyone remember the movie Victory? You do? So Victory was basically about Allied POWs in a POW camp, and some of them were soccer players. Michael Caine being one of them. And Sylvester Stallone was the only American in the camp at the time. Gotta have it, just like The Great Escape, you know, with a little bit of changes there. Well, anyways, in the movie, Sylvester Stallone just wants to escape. He thought his only way to escape was to be a member of the soccer team because the rest of the camp was more under watch versus the members of the soccer team that Michael Caine had selected. Well, Sylvester Stallone was able to escape, and when he did escape, they made a dummy of him, so when they were going through counting the prisoners, that everyone was there. And so there was a dummy of Sylvester Stallone being held up between two of the POWs. Now, does that sound familiar to a lot of people or no? Just the ones that watched it? Okay, well, guess what? It was based on a true story, but the opposite. See, they were playing the German soccer team from the Olympics. In this case right here, it actually happened in Canada. The German POWs decided to have a soccer game against the Canadian Guards, Canadian military police. Here's the dummy that they used. 2 German POWs made dummies to appear as them. So when they went through and did a head count, the dummy would be between all the other POWs. And it had gone successfully. It was very successful. But the problem was, one of the POWs had gotten caught in Niagara Falls. See, one went towards Niagara Falls, tried to make it over to the United States through the falls. The other one came through Detroit. Now, this is Uber Lieutenant Krug. I don't know if you've heard the story about the spy ring in Detroit. Anybody hear about that? It's been written in a few books, but they never actually talked about how the Germans escaped from a POW camp. And well, it didn't quite work out for them. The other POW was Eric Boll. I can't pronounce his name. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce it, but it was Eric Boll. He was caught at Niagara Falls. Now, a police commandant or commander or police chief in the Canadian side called the camp up and says, "Hey, Commandant, are you missing any of your prisoners?" He says, "No, they're all accounted for." And he says, "Well, do you have an Eric Boll as one of your POWs?" "Yes." "Well, you can come pick him up. He's in our jail." That is like, it was unbelievable. So it's like they couldn't believe it. Then they figured out how it happened. So an all-points bulletin went out through Canada about Krug on the loose, and even got to the FBI here in the United States. So they were looking for him. He got as far as Texas. And now that happened, well, he met up with a young lady here in Detroit who was actually part of a spy ring in Detroit, and referred him to Max Stefan, this gentleman here. And this is, again, Krug. Max was given out by Krug. Krug basically told him, "Oh yeah, you got a guy here in Detroit who's running a bar, basically a opera house or beer garden." And what happened was Max was so excited to actually get involved with something that he took Krug on a tour of Detroit for 4 days. He kept him there in Detroit. He even took him to a brothel. So that way he says, "Hey, I know it's been a while, you've been in here, stuck. I'm going to take care of it, don't worry about it." He sets him up, gives him money, gives him food, and sets him off on his way to Chicago so he can make his way to Mexico to get back in the war. Well, he gave him up. Well, at his trial, he acted stupid the whole time. "I don't know what you're talking about." It's just like, "I don't know what you mean." And when they convicted him, they were convicting him for treason, and they were going to execute him. And he says, "My Fuhrer will not let me die here in the United States." So basically, they knew he was acting stupid, but when he spoke up like that, they knew. Roosevelt eventually would commute his sentence to just life in prison, which eventually he would die in prison of leukemia. So the reason why Roosevelt did that was we had our spies there in Europe, and we didn't want the same repercussions with POWs or any of our spies there, so we decided not to execute this gentleman. But it's amazing how Hollywood finds a little bit of history and it turns around and makes it their own and fabricates a little bit more just to make it more exciting. To me, that was just exciting enough right there, finding out what had happened. All right. So Chris here a few years back had a presentation of film on the aircraft carriers on the Great Lakes, the Sable and the Wolverine. And one of the things that they had on board the Sable was a top secret Navy project that was being done up in Traverse City. And it was basically called Stag 1. And they were television guided airplanes, of which there'd be another plane following this drone right here, which would be equipped with bombs, torpedoes. It was also set up where it had a removable cockpit so they could transport it to an aircraft carrier, change it out. Well, it was pretty successful, but it was not utilized enough. Right here, this is the lighthouse, and it's called the Wauchance Lighthouse. It was decommissioned in early 1900s. Well, they used that lighthouse as a target, and you can see what's left of the lighthouse right here. There's actually a film of that drone flying right into that lighthouse and other drones dropping bombs and torpedoes into that lighthouse. It's basically, there was a historical society that was going to try and preserve the lighthouse and restore it. But this past year, because of COVID and everything else, they basically scrapped the idea of trying and saving the lighthouse. But it's interesting. Okay, now there's supposed to be 2,000 of these produced. There was only 300 produced. 50 of them were utilized in the Pacific, but Admiral Halsey basically said, I don't want any of those things on my aircraft carriers, so they had to work from a fixed base. Now, the fixed base itself would be some remote island near Japanese territory. They would fly these planes. The Japanese actually thought we had our own kamikazes. 38 actually got their targets out of the 50. So it's just interesting for that to happen. But this, you know, get the Japanese believe we would do a kamikaze and surprise them. All right, how many were aware of the African Americans training here and working here in the area? Not very many. Well, you can see right here, Willow Run had a large concentration of African Americans. Basically during the war, because a lot of the African Americans weren't going overseas, let me get a drink of water here. They came up here for work in the automotive industry, so that's what happened. They got jobs up here. They even had a subdivision that they developed for them called Soldier's Truth, which is, they try to take that and rechange it over to white American, but through the courts they turned around and made sure that it went to doing what it was supposed to do for African Americans housing. Right here, this group right here, they were part of the infantry that was stationed up in Sault Ste. Marie for assistance with the artillery. They were only up there for about a year because of racism up there. They were transferred back down south to Louisiana, which a few of them were executed by locals because they didn't want them fraternizing with their own local people. Anyways, even African American women were there. They went through processing over at Fort Custer. Fort Custer was the place where a lot of African Americans trained at. Fort Custer was utilized for a lot of different things. It was also a transfer place for POWs. When the POWs were sent over here from Africa, they had basically staging areas like Fort Custer. Fort Custer would distribute POWs all throughout Michigan and the northwest area. We had quite a few POWs camps up here in Michigan. Basically, they were former CCC camps, Civilian Conservation Corps camps, that were already shut down because people had gotten back to work. And then we had our Tuskegee Airmen training here. So one of the places that they were training at was, they were supposed to be training up in Selfridge at first. But since we had a racist commander there, he said, no, we're going to send them up to Oscoda, Michigan. And they trained up in Oscoda, Michigan for 9 months. One of the things was when they sent the Tuskegee Airmen overseas at first, they didn't have enough combat training, and a lot of people were getting upset for the fact that they need more combat training. They got a lot of combat training from men overseas when they first got there. They were shown a few techniques by other pilots that were over there, but not enough experience. And we not only trained men here for being fighter pilots, we also trained them for a bomber squadron, the 455th. Now this unit was going to be going overseas instead of the European theater. They were going to go to the Pacific theater. Unfortunately, they never got a unit activated. They had a lot of problems. It was the same commandant that was in charge of Selfridge that made it difficult for these men to get trained. One of the members of this unit, or this squadron, we'll go to this one. Photos are out of order. Do you recognize this gentleman?
Yes.
Yeah. Do you recognize him in the photo?
Oh, yeah.
Did you see him in the photo? No, he's right there. Oh, yeah. That's Coleman Young. A lot of, and I've had people tell, he wasn't a Tuskegee. I mean, he just said that. When I showed him this picture, he says, well, I stand corrected. I said, he was court-martialed. At one point in time, throughout the whole time actually, African Americans, even though they were officers, were not allowed to use the officers' club. They had to have their own officers' club. And every base that they went to, they never had an officer's club. So finally, when they got to Freeman Field, two of the African-American pilots went in to get a drink. Then two more came in, and it got to be over 100 African-Americans, including Coleman Young. And basically, Colonel Sedgwick basically said, that's it. I'm going to have to court-martial you guys. So all 100 of them were under court-martial. This is towards the end of the war. And they were all exonerated, and the colonel himself was actually court-martialed himself. But the gentleman, first African-American that went in there, though, did get disciplinary for insubordination, 3 months' pay. But Coleman Young, when he heard that Colonel Davis, who was also in charge of the Tuskegee Airmen, knew of Coleman Young prior, and he said, I got to get out of here. So he transferred off to another base for more training for night training bombing. Celestial bombing or something. I can't recall what it was, but basically through navigating through the stars. Now I'll come back to here. This is Lieutenant Robert Palmer. Now, Robert Palmer was an exemplary pilot, and basically when he was training, he heard of a game that was playing over here in Detroit with the African Americans football team and another football team, and the colonel himself, the base commander, was at that game. And he was supposed to be in charge of a unit, so they decided, let's do a flyby. Well, they did a flyby, but they were a little bit too high, so they figured they couldn't be seen in their cockpits. So he decided he was going to go back and make another flyby, and the rest of them said, no, I'm not doing it. He went and made a flyby, did a nice flyby, flying his plane in just at enough of an angle so they could see inside the cockpit it was an African American. Colonel found out about that and basically had him court-martialed also, but a lot of the trainers had said, he's one of our best pilots. You can't court-martial this guy. You know, he'll be a great asset overseas. So basically, again, he was just basically lost 3 months' pay for that incident. But one of the things that they did, he was the first one to sit there and fly under the Port Huron Blue Water Bridge. Here's the kicker. He did it at night. This is Alexander Jefferson right here. I met Alexander Jefferson when I was writing this book, first writing this book and writing my book about Detroit Metro, which I got some of the information about the plane he was flying. And he did the same thing. He said, yeah, I did that too. I says, and I was scared. And if you weren't scared, you were just stupid. He's still alive today, and he still occasionally does presentations himself. So I haven't been able to get in contact with him since then, but I want to give him a copy of my book. But it was just interesting to talk to him, and the characteristics of the plane that he was flying was the P-39 Airacobra, and talking to him about that because of the fact that Romulus Army Airfield was flying those planes in and out to Great Falls, Montana, so going on to Russia for the Lend-Lease Act for the Soviet Union. That was back. Okay, we did this one, we did that. Okay, now we go forward. We talk to Conan. All right, so back again with the women now. I'm going to talk. We had the women here working in the automotive plants. Right here. They were doing many things right here, like working with machinery. Women were making parachutes in some of these factories. You had women that were enlisting, and here's right here, this women from the over at the Groseal Naval Base, and Sonia Henning came by and made a appearance there to thank the women for serving. And then again, you had the women that were enlisting. The women enlisted in all branches as volunteers. So WACS, Women's Auxiliary Corps, and then the women again, I forgot what they were called for the Navy, but they volunteered for that. But they also volunteered for the Army Air Corps, but they weren't basically with the Auxiliary Army Air Corps, they actually had their own group, and that was known as the WASP and the
WAC, W-A-A-C.
no, it had to do with the ferrying division. But anyways, the first group that was actually organized was for the ferrying command, air transport, ATC, auxiliary transportation corps, or whatever. Anyways, they're transporting planes all across the United States from bases. Remember, Detroit Metro Airport was brought in as one back in 1940, and then by 41 was fully activated for and known as Romulus Army Airfield. Well, you had the women here. They were flying the P-39s. They were bringing these planes from Buffalo, New York, to Romulus, then on to Great Falls, Montana. And then while they were doing that, they were also ferrying other planes around the United States. I even found that through records that they actually flew one down to the Tuskegee field down there in Alabama. You also had the WACs there, though, too, that were actually training pilots. So they weren't just flying planes, they were actually training pilots, too. So they weren't part of the WASP, but they were actually still training for the Army Air Forces. All right, here's this lady here. I'll start with her first. Her name is Nancy Harkness Love. She was one of the orchestrators of the WASP pilots program. And this is all civilian work that they did. So they were only activated from 1943, beginning of 1940, well, actually fall of 1942 to the end of 1944. Nancy did her best. She was in charge of all the women for the ferrying command. And this woman right here, Hazel Young Lee, she was an Asian American. She was one of 2 Asian Americans that served with the WASP. And unfortunately for her, she passed away during the war. So, her parents were of Chinese descent, and she was doing her best before the war to try and purchase planes and supplies and stuff for the Chinese Army. She was very much against the Japanese, so people never got her confused for what she was trying to do, but she did join the WASP, and she was flying planes for the United States, around the United States. She was ferrying a P-39 to Great Falls, Montana. As she was approaching the field, another plane came in at the same time. Well, they were basically on a collision course, and they tried to raise the planes on the radio. Hers or the other pilot's radio was not working. And they crashed on landing, both of them. They basically collided while they were approaching the field. She was pulled from the wreckage and died 3 days later from her burns. When she was sent home to be buried in Washington, her brother was killed overseas also. He was part of the Asian American group that was fighting overseas in Europe. And his remains was returned back to Washington also. The family tried to get their children buried in that cemetery, but overlooking this river. And then unfortunately, they had to go to court to fight over it because they would not allow any Asian Americans in that cemetery. Even though they were serving the United States and they were Americans, they were not allowing them to be interned. They eventually, after the war, they were interned in that cemetery overlooking this river. All right. Speaking of the Asian Americans, do you know who this gentleman is? His son just passed away a couple of years ago. Basically, his son took over his seat, and now his wife takes over his seat for the congressional representation. That's John Dingell Sr.
Who was that?
John Dingell Sr.
Was that John Dingell?
Senior.
That's Senior.
Senior.
Senior, John Dingell's father. Yeah, basically John Dingell took his seat. So when he passed away in office. Prior to World War II starting in August of 1941, the Japanese was retaining 100 Americans from returning back to the United States. And President Roosevelt got with the Ways and Means Committee, and basically they came to the conclusion that in John's letter it's a good idea that maybe we should contain any Japanese here on visas and Japanese Americans, and in hopes of putting pressure on the Japanese of letting our 100 Americans come home. Otherwise, this is the best course of action we recommend. Well, that eventually didn't happen. Well, it did happen, but it happened when we went to war with Japan. Basically, it was the start of the internment camps for the Japanese. A lot of people aren't even aware of this. I contacted John Jr.'s office. I wanted to get a picture of him and his father both, because they were both aiming for the same thing, universal health care, when they were in office. But when I got hold of the press secretary, the secretary says, "Why do you want this?" Well, I says, one, I told him about this, and John, his father's involvement with the Japanese internment camps. And the gentleman says, "Well, that's a pretty harsh statement to make." I said, "Well, first I found the information on Wikipedia. He tried to blow me off." And I said, "But when I went through and did the research that they had on Wikipedia, I went back, I contacted the Japanese American Museum in California. And they referred me to the Roosevelt Library, of which I told them, this is where I got this letter from." And when I told him about this, he says, "Oh, this sounds very interesting. Unfortunately, we're not able to help you out with this, but good luck in your endeavors." Yeah, it's basically trying to keep history from being told and being brought out. Stuff that's been neglected over the years. All right. Do you remember the Andrews Sisters when they sang,
Yes, Boogie Boogie Boo.
Yeah, Boogie Woogie Bugler Boy, and many other songs that they sang during the war. There is a gentleman in Muskegon, Michigan. Prior to the war, he found his passion of music being in a high school band. And he dropped out of high school and started playing with all the big bands. Played with Tommy Dorsey and didn't play with Glenn Miller, but he played with a lot of other big-time bands in Chicago. He came home just a year or two before we went to war. And when we went to war, he wanted to do his part. He wanted to become a pilot. He thought he'd be better as a pilot. But they said, "No, you're too old to be a pilot, so this is what we'll have you do. We'll have you work with the Army Corps of Engineers." With his musical abilities, the base commander basically told him, "Okay, we're just going to have you play revelry and taps and do all that, morning and night." And he sort of got tired of hearing all the complaints. Now, there was 3 men that they thought was actually about the Boogie Woogie Bugler Boy. But in the case of the United States Army, this is the man. They would put it in Stars and Stripes. Because he got up one morning, got tired of hearing all the complaints, and started playing revelry in his own swing way. He got called to the general's office. Yes, he says, "Oh, that's it." General says, "I like what you did." Just like Glenn Miller, if you've seen that Glenn Miller story with James Stewart, he says, "I'm going to have you teach future buglers how to play." Yes, he said he seen more pep in these guys when he got up, that he thought it was inspirational, and that's what he wanted to see of our men. Now, a lot of people aren't even aware of this, but when taps is being played for funerals, nobody's actually playing those trumpets anymore, bugles. They've got a microchip inside those bugles. Now, when they blow through it, it's actually a guy from Arlington Cemetery that they're hearing from. It's just a recording from the gentleman that was actually playing the bugle there. So many of these funerals, services, and they have color guy come in, that's not really the guy playing it. He's just blowing into the horn.
It's an insert.
Yeah, that's it.
I do that.
You do, so you know what I'm talking about. See, the gentleman right here. Do you know how to play the bugle?
No.
Case in closed, there's not enough people out there that have the musical talent anymore. And it's a shame. You do have members that go into the military and they do bring their instruments and they do have bands, but Just not enough people out there trained to play the bugle. But anyways, I found this out from a gentleman out in Muskegon, a college professor. He had his students there, and what he did was he started talking about music during that time period. And one of the students says, well, the Boogie Woogie Bugler Boys from Muskegon. He says, oh, interesting. So after class, he did a little bit more research into it and found out he was right. So he started a pilgrimage of getting more information brought out about it. So they actually erected a statue there at the LST Museum, right here, and had a statue erected in his memory. Now, when he finished the service, he still continued playing with the bands for a short time, but big bands were going out and big singers were coming in, just like Frank Sinatra and that. And the need for a trumpet player was basically dying out. He ended up working for an automotive factory, and when his wife died, was completely done with playing the bugle. At one point in time in the 70s, he wore his uniform one last time, and that's him, his uniform, and his trumpet. All right, anyone know of Eddie Slovak?
Yeah. Yes.
All right, you know the story behind him? All right, so I don't need to speak too much about it, but he was from the Detroit area. He tried, when the war broke out, to try and enlist in the service, but basically they were considering him 4F. He had gotten in trouble with the law before the war as a minor. And when they looked at his criminal record, they said, no, you can't join. So eventually what had happened was he got married and thought, well, maybe this will change my status. When they seen he was married, they allowed him to join. Again, he made it overseas, made it over to Europe. And he started getting shell-shocked and got separated from the unit and decided, that's it, I'm done with the war. And he basically, when he was reunited with the Americans, because he was with a Canadian unit, he says, I'm not going to fight. I said, forget this. And he says, you need to think about this. So he decided to write a letter, and that's it. Court-martial. When they found him guilty, he was set for execution. He wrote a letter to Eisenhower. Eisenhower read his letter, and him saying that, well, I didn't have much education growing up and stuff, but please let me go back to fighting. Don't execute me. I don't want to die. Eisenhower said to one of his subordinates, says, I can't find myself commuting the sentence. He says, I'm afraid that if he was to go off and fight with his colleagues, he basically said, I'm afraid he'd run off again. So no, the execution stands. He had to be executed. He was buried in an unmarked grave. For years, his wife tried to have his body exhumed and brought back to Michigan. And when she passed away, the executive for Oakland County, I believe it was Oakland County, got with President either Carter or Reagan to have his body exhumed and brought back to the United States and be laid to rest with his wife, and he was able to do that. So it's a sad story. That's a case of, again, PTSD. Back then we didn't know about as much then. Everyone recalls the incident where Pan slapped the kid up and was going to shoot him right there in the spine. He got disciplined, but nothing was done for this gentleman here. All right, this one I like. This gentleman here is Joe Burley. He was nicknamed Jumpin' Joe Burley, all right, because he was very good at jumping out of airplanes. He was with the 101st Airborne and bailed out over France like everyone else, got separated from his unit. And he ended up with a French group, was fighting with them and got captured by the Germans. Now he really did not like Germans, you can tell by his mugshot. I like this guy. This guy is something else. He escaped from his camp and tried to head back to the front lines, but got captured, which made him even more wanting to get back to his own lines. So he was sent back to the same camp and escaped again. Guess what? He got captured again. He decided, all right, I won't have any of this. Instead of going back to his own lines, he decided to trick the Germans he thought he'd double back. So when he escaped a third time, instead of heading back to his lines, he went inwards instead. He ran into a woman tank commander, a Russian woman tank commander. And he pleaded and begged her to let him fight with them, which he did. He fought with the Russians till the end of the war. Yep, he fought. He did everything. He produced bombs, fought with guns and whatnot, and even liberated the POW camp where he was from. That's how he got his picture. He was able to go through the commandant's files and get his mugshot. So that's kind of neat. But during that whole time, when he was captured the first time, they found his ID tags on another soldier. And so they thought he was dead. They sent home a message telling the mother and father that their son died in combat. And they had a funeral for him at a church. And even had a headstone for his grave, but no body. When he was liberated back to the United States, because a Russian general found out about this American and had to meet this American that fought with the Russians. And he congratulated him, thanked him, and gave him papers so he could get back to the United States. And he came home. And then he was brought back to life. It's like they were happy to have him. He got married in the same church where they had his funeral. I am not done. Back during the Carter administration, I forgot the name of the president for the Russians, but he came over here to visit Clinton, and they had him come to the United States. They had Joe go to Washington, D.C. to receive a medal from President Clinton. Not only did he receive a medal from Clinton, he also received a medal from the president of Russia. He was the only American to ever receive a medal from the Russians. And the general that met him actually presented him with a gun also from World War II. So a little bit of local history here and somebody with an impressive background. Yes. All right. Does anyone know about
Sonny Elliott.
Yes, that's right. Do you know what his real name was? That's right, Marwin Elliott Schlossberg. He was a bomber pilot. I had a chance to talk with him before he finished his time off with WWJ. Had 3 interviews with him. I asked him first, what was it like to fly the B-24 bomber? And he actually flew one that was out of Little Run. He says, it was a beautiful plane to fly. And him being a storyteller he is, he tells me, he says, well, let me tell you this. I said, the trainer took us up to a high enough altitude to hang on, make sure you're strapped in. He said he did the most amazing thing. He took the plane in a barrel roll. Now, whether to believe that or not, just for him to tell that story is interesting. But he did tell me this. He said he owed the United States government 2 planes.
Oh.
I said, what do you mean? Well, he says, I can't be held accountable for the second one because the Germans shot me down. The first one, though, we had engine problems. One of the engines caught on fire, and we had to bail out, and it crashed in the mountains. And he said, after the war, and darn, I didn't get a picture of it, but he actually had a bill for that plane. The U.S. government charged him for that plane, which he never paid. So it's just an amazing story. So again, I mentioned he was a POW. When he was on a mission and his plane was shot down, the crew all bailed out. They all made it. When he bailed out, he lost his ID tags and he lost his boots. But he seen a barn, and he started going towards the barn, but was met by a German farmer with his shotgun. So the local police was called. He was picked up, and they questioned him. They asked him what his religion was. First thing that came to mind for him, not saying Jewish, but Lutheran. And he stuck by it the whole time. Now, I asked him, I said, were you ever afraid of the Germans finding out your actual religion? He says, many a times. They actually had the Jewish Americans in a separate barracks for them. Well, he had a chaplain there that was there in the camp that was also captured, and he went to speak to him, and he basically told him, look, I says, I feel sort of guilty of telling this lie. And I'm thinking maybe I should tell the Germans. He says, you're not to tell anybody about this. You're going to stick with your new religion. You're going to march yourself out of here. We're never going to speak of this again. Well, he did. But he was an entertainer. He believed in keeping people's spirits up, so he did a lot of stuff at the camp to keep the men occupied. He had all kinds of concerts and programs and stuff for them. I found this out from a scrapbook that he had kept. Well, anyways, a group or whatever came through and they gave them all kinds of these blank books so they could write journals and stuff and keep themselves occupied. And whenever somebody had something neat in their book, they'd say, hey, can you put this in my book? So a gentleman had come along and taken boxing gloves and used them as binders for the books. One guy else was taking wings or not wings, but they were taking tin cups and making these German wings, actually just wings themselves, with a K in the center, which Kriegsgefangen, which basically meant prisoner of war. So he had that on his journal. But after the war ended and they were liberated, he had a chance to go through like our other previous gentleman. I'm losing track. Anyways, he went through the commandant's files and found his photo and his ID. And on the ID, the information about him, they wrote down Judah. So they figured he was Jewish anyways. But he kept up the ruse that he was Lutheran. And then after the war, he stayed with his adopted religion. So he never went back to practicing as a Jewish faith. All right. Michigan had quite a few ties with the atomic bomb being developed. This right here is Jane, and this is, I believe, Robert. Where are we at here? Come on, Cam, where are you? Oh, name's down. Anyways, he was a physicist, and he was working on the Manhattan Project out there, out west. And his wife was a librarian. His wife had the highest security clearance in the organization, besides her husband. So they worked on the Manhattan Project, but after the war he continued working for the government on projects, and they felt as if they were always being watched. Even during the Nixon administration, they were being watched. One of the problems was Jane here had a cousin that was involved, and I forgot his name. So he had ties with the Communist Party and decided she needed to keep things quiet. When her husband passed away, she asked her neighbor to come over and help them shred all their documents that they had on the Manhattan Project or anything, because she didn't want the U.S. government coming in and arresting her for communism, because she wasn't a communist. She was a true American. She just didn't want to be accused of being communist. But it's just interesting to find out about that. We also have a gentleman that was from Monroe, that same thing. He was involved with the Fermi plant, but himself was part of the Manhattan Project and worked down in Tennessee on the project. All right. Okay, this gentleman here, Mr. Frederick Bach, I'm sorry. He is from the same town as those kids that purchased the troop gliders. He's from Greenville, Michigan. All right. He was involved on the dropping of the bomb over Nagasaki. He wasn't the pilot, but the plane that he was originally assigned was boxcar. That was his plane. What had happened was the original plane that was supposed to fly over Nagasaki had some problems with the rack to drop the bomb. And his plane was already rigged and set up to carry the atomic bomb. He was basically flying another plane following boxcar called the Great Artiste, and they were filming all the footage that they could and readings, everything that was happening with that atomic bomb when it dropped. They were the ones responsible for all that footage on that. And another gentleman that was on his plane was Master Sergeant Matthew Arnold. Matthew Arnold. He's from Rochester, Michigan. So you have a few ties here. You have a few gentlemen that were also on Enola Gay that were from Michigan too also. There's some information about them up at the Michigan Military Historical or Michigan Heroes Museum up in Frankenmuth. But I wrote about them in my book also. But it's just interesting to find out that it was actually his plane that was used to drop the bomb. Later on, the Great Artiste would be scrapped, and we know what happened to Boxcar. Boxcar is over at the United States Air Force Museum in Dayton, and of course, Enola Gay is at the Smithsonian. All right, one of the things that's not talked about is the shipbuilding here in Michigan. Now, there's a lot of ships that were built in Michigan, but they were small support ships, minesweepers, and other type of ships. Up in Bay City, Michigan, the full shipbuilding company, when they had a unique way of building their ships. They built them upside down. It was easier for them to build the ships upside down because they figured welding the bottom of the ship for anybody that was working on would have to lay on their back to weld the bottom of the hull. This way they could weld the bottom of the hull from the top. Made it much simpler. So they had a cradle system, and there was 2 other companies that were allowed to use that technique to build the ships. And when the ships were done, they'd roll a motor over, build the infrastructure on top, and then launch them. This ship here, though, I thought it was more unique for me to talk about because it's from my hometown, Trenton. Trenton, American Cruiser Company, they built 9, like a minesweeper type ship. Well, 2 of them were on the Lend-Lease Act. This was one of them. One was sent off to the Soviet Union. This one here was sent off to Norway, paid for the Norwegian Navy. Of course, Norway itself was captured by the Germans, so they were operating outside the territories. What they would do is they would go into their Norway offshore, bring spies to Norway, and then bring back refugees and downed pilots or airmen or anybody coming back to England. It was known as the Shetland bus. After the war, the ship continued on for the Norwegian fleet, and then afterwards was used for training for the sort of like the Boy Scouts, but like in their cases like the Sea Scouts. It was lost in a storm back in the 50s. They still have one of the 3 ships. They had 3 ships that were from the Lend-Lease Act, and it's totally restored in one of their ports now as a museum. All right. This is the sign of the Japanese, the Missouri. You know why I have that up here? Because this is my last photo, too, by the way. No ideas? You thought maybe anyone from Michigan? No. It actually has to do with something that is from Michigan on board the ship. Can't figure it out?
The desk?
That's right, it's not a desk. The desk originally that was set up for the signing of the papers, well, the captain thought, that's too small. So he sent off several seamen to go find a bigger desk. So they went searching, scouring every officer's quarters, and then they ended up in the mess hall. And they had just cleaned up after mess, and these are foldable tables, steel tables. They brought this out, and they covered it with a cloth, and it was made here in Michigan. I had to do that. And that table is now at the Naval Academy right now on display as if it's still set up for the signing for the surrender of the Japanese. Just a little bit of information there. I mean, there's a lot of stuff here that's, Chris has got a lot of stuff on display. You've seen it. The Ford radiator company when they made the steel pots or the helmets, which many of them our soldiers wore overseas, including that general that died in the air glider. But thank you very much for coming out. These are a lot of stories more inside my book that I've written about some of these people. If you're interested, I am selling them for $20, and you'll find out more yourself. Or basically, a lot of the information I got is from our local small town museums and historical societies. And that's where I found all this stuff at. I did stumble across some stuff just by accident. But like this photo and several other photos, I've gone out of state for. I've gone to Pensacola to get some of these photos from my book. Some of them I took myself at different places. But it's just interesting to see our own history talked about instead of the automotive industry and the bomber plant. So thank you very much for coming out. Appreciate it. If you're interested, I can pull up on my computer because that meats, same the scrap meats and the fats, Disney did, as I mentioned, a video. So I have that video on my computer. I can pull that up for anyone interested in seeing that cartoon. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.